Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a Monday. It is a Monday beyond the halfway point in January. We have completed the first round of National Football League playoff games. We're heading into the championship game of each division this coming weekend, with the Super Bowl, obviously, early in February, as you know. It is a pleasure to be with you. Winter has arrived in Appalachia. I think winter has arrived throughout the eastern part of the United States, where our temperatures this morning are in single digits. Although I will say right now that the sun is shining and the wind is rather, it's almost non-existent. So it's not really that bad outside, to be honest with you. It's wintertime. It's mid-January. What can we expect? I appreciate your being with us here at the Virtual Center as we move rapidly through the month of January in the year 2016. I do invite you to actively participate in our conversation by taking advantage of the phone number that we have available for you just for that purpose. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. And 4676, as you know, translates on your keypad into Horn, H-O-R-N. If you'd like to email me directly, I would really enjoy hearing from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. And I call your attention to our Facebook page, as I have for almost each program over the last 3 or 4 months. If you go to Facebook, if you are a regular user of Facebook, and go to the home page and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to that page and to the number of postings over the weeks that I have put on it. Many of them are, I think, designed to encourage and solicit comment. So they are not only intended for purposes of providing information, but also are an effort to use the information provided in these postings in order to raise some, what I think are very, very significant and controversial questions here in our current period. And so again, I do solicit your comments to those postings. You can comment on the Facebook page itself, where comments are solicited. You can comment by going to my email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. Or you can pick up the phone and dial in and share your thoughts on the air. Again, phone number 304-663-4676. It's been a while since we've been together, and I will say, and I haven't really shared a lot of the specifics of this with Bob Kincaid as yet, but over the next couple of weeks, our broadcast time may be a little bit uncertain. I say that because there is the possibility of a couple of things happening tomorrow, which might make it impossible for me to do a program. There is a meeting that I've been asked to attend that is in the offing, but it's not really set up yet. And if that meeting doesn't come off on tomorrow, it'll probably happen on Wednesday. So at this point, I'm uncertain as to what to say, except that I hope that you will understand that if there is not a live program tomorrow, it's because of that, and we'll be back on Wednesday. On the other hand, if we do have a program tomorrow, then chances are we will not have one on Wednesday. But either way, just stick with us and hang in there with us. We're trying to do the best we can. One moment. Bit of a cough break there. I appreciate your tolerance and your patience. I'd like to return. You'll recall when last we were together in our live programs, we were heavily into the Justice John Paul Stevens dissent in the Heller case, and of course, with the debates on the issue of guns being so prominent in today's society, the Heller decision of the Supreme Court is getting a lot of attention. And I think it's quite appropriate that we spent time over the last couple of weeks of our live programs, our time together, looking at the majority opinion in District of Columbia versus Heller, which is written by Justice Scalia, and the dissenting opinion, which was written by Justice John Paul Stevens. I'm not going to go back through all of the issues that we dealt with, except for the fact that it's been almost a week since last we addressed these issues. But I would like to at least call your attention back to a few of the conclusions that I reached about that particular decision after looking at both the majority opinion and the dissenting opinion. It seems to me, and I believe I said that quite definitively when we were last together, that there is little question in my mind that Justice Stevens' dissenting opinion is much more substantive in terms of its analysis than is the majority opinion of Justice Scalia. It is, and I did say this, it is my opinion, not just an opinion. I'd almost be willing to go to the mat with people and argue that this decision by Justice Scalia and the conservative majority on the court is a classic example of what I've termed judicial activism, what many people term judicial activism. It is basically going into a particular case. In fact, selecting a particular case selecting in the court's cases, most of the cases that come before it are not chosen to be heard. The ones that are heard, the ones that are chosen to be heard, are chosen principally because of the judicial principles that a particular group of people on the court, the majority on the court, believes to be significant. Consequently, it is my belief that the very decision to hear the Heller case, District of Columbia versus Heller, the decision to hear that case is because the conservative majority on the court wanted to use the circumstances of that particular case in order to reach the conclusion that they reached in Heller, which is to assert once and for all that American citizens do indeed, under the Second Amendment, have a constitutional right to keep and bear arms. That's the decision conservatives wanted to reach, and it seems to me that they were looking for a case that would give them the opportunity to make that point definitively, and they did that in District of Columbia versus Heller. Consequently then, because that was the driving agenda, that was the driving intent, if you will, of the decision before it was even reached, it seems to stand to reason that the substantive analysis incorporated in that decision would more than likely be a little bit less substantive and a little bit less definitive than it might have been. And what I mean is the desire to reach a particular decision seemed to be the most important factor throughout the opinion as you read it, throughout Justice Scalia's opinion as you read it. Consequently, he goes to great lengths and takes really, I think, very questionable leaps and bounds in order to manufacture a case to support the particular decision he wants to make. On the other hand, I believe that Justice Stevens' dissenting opinion is so much more substantive and so much more meaningful than is Justice Scalia's. I really believe that if we had an objective panel of experts to look at those two opinions, and you were able to remove politics from it, I do believe that hands down Justice Stevens' decision would be considered by the experts to be much more substantive, much more meaningful, much better argued, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to take total credit, if indeed there is credit associated with this. I don't want to take total credit for my conclusion that this is an example of judicial activism. Although he doesn't use the term, Justice Stevens, in his dissenting opinion right at the very beginning, makes that point. This is a paragraph I've read twice, but I think it really bears reading a third time, because I think it basically lays out exactly what the issues are. Justice Stevens says, quote, "The opinion the court announces today fails to identify any new evidence supporting the view that the amendment was intended to limit the power of Congress to regulate civilian uses of weapons. Unable to point to any such evidence, the court stakes its holding on a strained and unpersuasive reading of the amendment's text. Significantly different provisions in the 1689 English Bill of Rights and in various 19th century state constitutions, post-enactment commentary that was available to the court when it decided Miller, and ultimately a feeble attempt to distinguish Miller that places more emphasis on the court's decisional process than on the reasoning in the opinion itself." Translation: Justice Stevens is alleging exactly the same thing that I did, that the decision seems to drive the evidence here, the analysis, rather than the other way around. The evidence doesn't support the decision. The decision seems to dictate the evidence. And I think that's what Justice Stevens is saying. In that case, in that paragraph, Justice Stevens mentions the Miller decision. And in the Miller decision, as you know, that was based on the 1934 congressional legislation entitled the National Firearms Act. And in Miller, the Supreme Court said that the Second Amendment that protects the right to keep and bear arms for certain military purposes, but that it does not curtail the legislature's power to regulate the non-military use and ownership of weapons, is both the natural reading of the amendment's text and the interpretation most faithful to the history of its adoption. In other words, in Miller, the Supreme Court had ruled that the militia clause of the Second Amendment clearly was the context within which the right to keep and bear arms should be read. And as Justice Stevens says, there has been no additional evidence about the Second Amendment since then. So the only conclusion one can reach, and I think Stevens would probably agree with us, that if the Heller decision seeks to reverse the decision without any additional evidence, then the result is that the reading of the text by the conservative majority is indeed strained and unpersuasive. And we looked, when we dealt with the Stevens dissenting opinion some time ago, we looked at a lot of the evidence. And again, I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind, because I think it really is a strong piece of evidence that supports Stevens's dissenting opinion. And that is that when the Second Amendment was drafted by the Congressional Committee chaired by James Madison, that committee had all of the state recommended amendments before it. And several of the recommended state amendments addressed the issue of the right of keeping and bearing arms, not only for purposes of militia service, but also for purposes of individual self-defense. In other words, there were a lot of amendments proposed that were quite consistent with what the court finally rules in Heller. However, Madison and the Congressional Committee chose not to select those, rather to phrase the Second Amendment as it is written, which is to relate the context of militia service to the right to keep and bear arms. That conscious choice by those who drafted the Second Amendment seems to be overwhelming evidence to me that what the court is doing in District of Columbia versus Heller is extreme, is unpersuasive, and is a classic example of judicial activism. I mentioned the last time we discussed this that there were a couple of issues that remain unaddressed that I'd like to return to before we leave this topic entirely, and I'd like to take a few moments of our time right now to do that. And I'm still in the Stevens dissenting opinion. An important point, it seems to me, is that Justice Stevens goes right to the Oxford English Dictionary and finds there the term bear arms is related to, quote, serving as a soldier, doing military service, fighting. In other words, the Oxford English Dictionary itself defines the idea of bearing arms in the context of military service. The other thing that Stevens does, another thing that Stevens does in his dissenting opinion, which I think is quite powerful, is that he goes to the very same places that Justice Scalia went in order to justify the opinion that the conservative majority wanted to make in Heller. He goes right to their evidence and refutes it. And I wanted to share a couple of those places with you. Two of the areas, and there are three. Justice Scalia goes back to the English Bill of Rights of 1689, and Justice Stevens takes that on as well. Let me read the relevant paragraph. So Justice Scalia historically goes to three historical precedents, to justify the conservative majority opinion in Heller. The first one is the English Bill of Rights of 1689. And this is what Justice Stevens says about going to the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The English Bill of Rights responded to abuses by the Stuart monarchs. Among the grievances set forth in the Bill of Rights was that the king had violated the law, quote, by causing several good subjects, being Protestants, to be disarmed at the same time when papists were both armed and employed contrary to law. The point is that Justice Stevens refutes that allegation by pointing out that this grant did not establish a general right of all persons or even all Protestants to possess weapons. Rather, the right was qualified in two distinct ways in the English Bill of Rights. First, the right to bear arms was restricted to those of adequate social and economic status. Second, it was only available subject to regulation by Parliament. I think the point to keep in mind then is that contradicts or refutes Justice Scalia's attempt to try to claim that the people, the right of the people to bear arms in the Second Amendment, meant all of the people. Then he goes to the English Bill of Rights, but the English Bill of Rights restricts the meaning of people. I keep taking these little breaks because I think I'm coming down with that seasonal cold, or I'm doing a little bit of sneezing and coughing, and I apologize. So in a sense, Justice Scalia's reliance on the English Bill of Rights for support for the decision in Heller is refuted by Stevens in the point that he makes the case that the English Bill of Rights was very restrictive in who could bear arms. So that mere fact contradicts Scalia, who tried to argue that the people's right to bear arms in the Second Amendment was universal. So that takes care of that. The second major place where Justice Scalia goes for evidence is in Blackstone's commentaries, the famous Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. Blackstone explained, this is from Justice Stevens's dissent, Blackstone explained that, quote, if words happen to be still dubious, we may establish their meaning from the context. In other words, what Stevens is doing is going to Blackstone because Blackstone makes the point that context is very important to the meaning of text. We know that. We've been back numerous times here at the Virtual Center pointing that out. That the meaning that words themselves seem to have can change dramatically depending on what the context within which they're being used is. So what Stevens is doing is going to Blackstone himself, who makes a major argument for context, keeping in mind, of course, that in the Second Amendment, the context for the right of the people to keep and bear arms is the militia context. So in a sense, what Stevens is arguing is Blackstone actually supports his dissenting opinion even more than it does Justice Scalia's majority opinion. And let me read exactly what Stevens says. What is important about Blackstone is the instruction he provided on reading the sort of text before us today. Blackstone described an interpretive approach that gave far more weight to preambles than the court counseling, and that, quote, the fairest and most rational method to interpret the will of the legislator is by allows with which it may be of singular use to compare a word or a sentence whenever they are ambiguous, equivocal, or intricate. Thus, the preamble is often called in to help the construction of an act of Parliament. What Blackstone is saying is that when the language itself seems to be ambiguous, could mean more than one thing, then you have to go to the context in order to nail down exactly what it does mean. And in the Second Amendment, going to the context in order to nail down meaning of the people's right to keep and bear arms is to put it in the military context in which the Second Amendment was written. And the third place that Justice Stevens goes to refute Justice Scalia's majority opinion is in the writing of Justice Joseph Story. Story, as many of you will know, wrote his commentaries in 1833 on the Constitution of the United States. Story was a conservative who was challenging in 1833 the interpretations of Justice John Marshall, who, as we know, had been Chief Justice of the Court since 1803. Many conservatives go to Story's commentaries in order to find the conservative challenge to what in today's terms would be a very liberal direction that Justice Marshall was taking the court. If you recall, Justice Marshall, in decision after decision, Chief Justice John Marshall was giving power to the central government at the expense of the states. In other words, the driving theme of the entire speakership or Chief Justiceship of John Marshall was to fill in the blanks within the Constitution and extend power to the central government whenever there was an opportunity to do so. You can go through cases from Marbury versus Madison and judicial review all the way up through the Contract Clause, through the Commerce Clause, and all the rest of it to indicate in some of Marshall's most famous decisions that he was expanding and extending the power of the federal government. In today's political terms, more and more power in the hands of the federal government is the way we define progressivism or liberalism. So the challenge to Marshall's direction in the early 19th century was Joseph Story and his commentaries on the Constitution of the United States written in 1833. This is a major part, it seems to me, of Justice Scalia's effort to justify the conservative majority opinion in Heller. And for that, Justice Scalia quotes the following sentence from Story's commentaries. Quote, "The right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic, since it offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers, and will generally, even if these are successful in the first instance, enable the people to resist and triumph over them." That sentence by Joseph Story speaks loud and clear to the English history, which lays out the traditions of the right of the people to bear arms against an authoritarian, overbearing government. And Scalia uses it, that sentence, to justify the decision in Heller, the people's right to keep and bear arms. What Justice Stevens does, he puts that sentence by Joseph Story into context by quoting the entire paragraph within which that sentence appears. And what we'll find, is that within the context in which that sentence was written, Story's meaning is exactly the opposite. Let me prove that by reading the paragraph in question. Quote, this is Joseph Story in his 1833 commentaries on the Constitution of the United States. Quote, "The importance of the Second Amendment will scarcely be doubted by any persons who have duly reflected upon the subject. The militia is the natural defense of a free country against sudden foreign invasions, domestic insurrections, and domestic usurpations of power by rulers. It is against sound policy for a free people to keep up large military establishments and standing armies in time of peace, both from the enormous expenses with which they are attended and the facile means which they afford to ambitious and unprincipled rulers to subvert the government or trample upon the rights of the people. The rights of citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium, the counterforce, if you will, of the liberties of a republic, since it offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers and will generally, even if these are successful in the first instance, enable the people to resist and triumph over them. That's the sentence I read earlier. Story goes on. And yet, though this truth would seem so clear, and the importance of a well-regulated militia would seem so undeniable, it cannot be disguised that among the American people there is a growing indifference to any system of militia discipline and a strong disposition, from a sense of its burdens, to be rid of all regulations. How it is practicable to keep the people duly armed without some organization, it is difficult to see. There is certainly no small danger that indifference may lead to disgust, and disgust to contempt, and thus gradually undermine all the protection intended by the clause of our National Bill of Rights, unquote. What Story is arguing is that in spite of the fact that history tells us that the right to bear arms has traditionally been the people's protection against an overbearing government, the fact of the matter is the greatest defense against an overbearing government is a well-armed militia. And because of the danger that the militia is not well disciplined, then allowing the people to bear arms when the militia is not well disciplined is even a greater danger. So consequently, the Second Amendment calls for the idea of a well-regulated militia. Conclusion: this particular reliance on Joseph Story doesn't support Justice Scalia in the Heller decision. It refutes it. And the only way that Justice Scalia can use Story to support his finding in Heller is to take the particular sentence in question out of the context in which Story wrote it. Because within the context, Story is not supporting Scalia, he's refuting him. It seems to me then that there is justifiable basis for claiming that Justice Stevens' dissent in Heller, the evidence that Justice Stevens provides in that dissent, is much more telling and much more meaningful, consequent than the evidence, the textual evidence that Justice Scalia provides to support the conservative majority. Conclusion: the Heller decision is a political decision. It is driven by the fact that the conservatives hold a 5-4 majority on the court at this particular time. That's the principal reason they were able to get the decision through. The evidence does not support the majority opinion in District of Columbia versus Heller. I don't think there's any question but that this is true. And at least from my perspective, that's really about as much time as I would like to devote to this issue of the regulation of weapons, of firearms, i.e., our attention to the Second Amendment. I think that Heller is a political decision, was a political decision. I think it's ripe for being overturned by a different Supreme Court. But the irony of the situation, should indeed there come a Supreme Court with a different direction on the part, the ideological direction on the part of the majority. In other words, if the majority ceases to be conservative in its ideological priorities, then the basis is there to overturn the Heller decision at some point. And I don't believe it's going to be necessary to strain language in order to overturn Heller, because I think Justice Stevens has provided sufficient evidence for a court that was inclined to do so, to overturn that particular decision. I don't know when that period might be. I don't know when that will come. I think basically the results of the election that we're facing this coming fall, this coming November, is going to go a long way, because many people anticipate that the next president of the United States will be appointing 2, if not 3, additional justices to the Supreme Court. So it seems to me that this particular election this fall is so important, not only for decisions like Citizens United, but also for decisions like District of Columbia versus Heller. So with that, if you have comments or you have a point of view that you would like to share, this, it seems to me, would be an optimum time to pick up the phone and give us a call at 304-663-4676, because we would love to hear from you. The issue that I would like to begin to address at this point, I understand that this is not an issue that we can complete today. This is an issue that probably is going to take 2 or 3 of our sessions here at the Virtual Center, if not even more. This is an issue that I mentioned several weeks ago as one that we really needed to take up and we needed to devote some attention to. And over the last week and a half or 2 weeks, I've been doing that. And I feel fairly comfortable now that I've done enough reading and enough research to do what I hope is a credible job in addressing what I think is one of the most critical issues facing the nation today. It's been one of the critical issues facing the nation since the very beginning, and that is the issue of our two-party system. And I think without question, one must begin any attention on our two-party system to point out the status or the situation that our two-party system currently is in. I think most people would agree that our two-party system at this point is in rather questionable condition. As a result of the polarization that exists in Washington, most people have been extremely frustrated by the inability or unwillingness of our Congress to do anything. I think that frustration was borne out last Tuesday night in President Obama's final 8th State of the Union address. The very final portion of the President's State of the Union, you'll recall, focused on the state of our political fabric here in America. And the president, if you'll recall, made a very dramatic plea, I think a very persuasive argument, with the idea that if the nation is going to address some of the major problems facing it, then these are concerns and issues that we must face together. The president is clearly suggesting then that the polarization and unwillingness to do business by reaching across the aisle must end if the nation is to seriously take on some of the issues that it is confronting. These are issues, this is an issue you'll recall that we took on several months ago. You'll remember that we were looking at a paper. In fact, we pretty much went through the entire presentation, written by Larry Kramer, who was the previous dean of the law school at Stanford University and is now president of the Hewlett Foundation. And you'll recall from several months back that one of the things we learned was that through Larry Kramer's leadership, the Hewlett Foundation has set aside a substantial amount of Hewlett money in order to take on the breakdown in our two-party system and the polarization that so indicates the depths and seriousness of that breakdown. As I recall, and I haven't looked at the Kramer paper presentation since last we dealt with it, but as I recall, Kramer made the point that polarization in our two-party system is not, in spite of the fact that many people think it is not really the problem. Rather, it's more symbolic of a more serious problem. And the fact of the matter is, Kramer goes back to the founders, specifically to James Madison, and to Madison's call in Federalist number 10, and in other papers, Federalist papers as well, Madison's call for the idea of creating an educated citizenry that will look for and learn the characteristics of representatives who would be willing to put the public interest, the national interest, against self-interest, which is primarily dominant at the local level. In other words, Kramer's point is that Madison's whole idea of the Constitution in the first place was an effort to move decision-making from the state sovereignty that existed under the Articles of Confederation to the national level in order to increase or to make it more possible for representatives at the national level to take on the major national issues that confronted the nation. And in order to put national issues above local issues, you had to move power from the local level to the national level. And Madison, toward the end of Federalist number 10, makes the case when he talks about taking decisions and moving them through a medium, through a chosen body of citizens whose patriotism and love of justice. And what we learned, and what Kramer argues, is that what Madison was talking about there was a series of elections from the most local level through the regional level to the state level and finally to the national level. And through that process of weeding out localism, you would, Madison believed, finally get to the point where you would have a Congress comprised not of ideologues driven and controlled by local issues and local desires and self-interest. You would more likely have a group of decision makers at the national level whose priorities had become national. Delegates, representatives whose interests had become less local and more national, had become less controlled by self-interest and localism, and more controlled by the public interest and nationalism. So that's what Madison is talking about in Federalist Number 10, and Kramer addresses it. And so what Larry Kramer is doing is setting aside in the Madison Initiative, which is part of the agenda of the Hewlett Foundation, putting aside substantial money, Hewlett money, in order to undertake strategies designed to reinstitute the emphasis on deliberation, negotiation, and compromise that are so critical to Madison and the success of the Constitution, and are so necessary in our world today. I think we spent quite a bit of time on Larry Kramer's presentation. It's probably about 6 months ago now. I think the issue continues to be a major one. Obviously, Kramer's group, the Hewlett Foundation, has not had the kind of success as we move through the preliminary jockeying for position in both Republican and Democratic parties as we move towards the fall election. I think it's obvious that there's still a lot of work to be done. I think there is major discord within the major parties. I don't think the idea of consensus between the major parties is evident at all. If Kramer is correct, if the pundits are correct, if Madison was correct, and if the only way to seriously and substantively and positively deal with national issues is to place them before a body whose priorities are national in scope, whose priority interests are the public interest rather than private interest or local self-interest, then it seems to me that we've got a long way to go. It also seems to me that the issue of the nature of our two-party system, the options or the alternatives that parties might have in our society, and some of the history of that process seems to be called for. This seems to be an issue that screams for attention here at the Virtual Center. I think it's a major gap in what we've done so far here at the Virtual Center. We've been on now for we're within 2 months of 3 years. I mean, it's hard to believe that on the 11th of March, we will have completed 3 years of programming here at the Virtual Center. And while we took up the issue of two parties some time ago, I can remember making the distinction between parties that are clearly representative and parties that are not, responsible parties versus non-responsible parties, and making that point in what they mean, and how that depending on the meaning, responsible parties stand for particular issues and are supported by particular supporters. Non-responsible parties are much more pluralistic, much more diversified in scope. They are broad enough and moderate enough in their positions to attract a variety of people from different political and ideological perspectives. And that's been the driving force of the nature of our two-party system. I think as we think back, we can also recall that there's one major point about political parties themselves that I think all of us need to address and need to take into consideration right at the very beginning. And that's the obvious one, that there's nothing in the Constitution of the United States that speaks to or addresses the issue of political parties. And part of the reason for that is because at the time of the Constitution and even before, the attitude towards political parties was out and out negative. The whole idea from a national perspective, the whole idea or attitude about parties was that for a nation to be successful, it had to find a way to prevent them. And if you think back to the time of the Declaration of Independence, the issue that we dealt with here at the Virtual Center was on the idealism that drove independence in this country, the idealism of those who supported independence from Great Britain, the idealism that is contained in the preamble to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. All men being created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In order to attain those rights, governments are instituted amongst men, deriving their power from the consent of the governed. And whenever government oversteps its contractual obligations to protect people's natural rights and tries to seize more power than that, then the people not only have a right, they have a duty to overthrow that government and to replace it with a government which will abide by the contractual obligations in what John Locke referred to as the social compact. If you think about that, it reeks of idealism. It is extremely visionary. It is extremely optimistic. And it lays out an agenda for a Republican form of government here in America, which will be driven more than anything else by a reliance on the civic virtue of citizens. The idea is that all citizens, through the use of reason, will clearly be able to recognize the public interest, what the nation needs and what the nation must have at particular points in time. And that good people, whoever they are, wherever they come from, whatever their regional priorities and interests, whatever their ideological and religious priorities and interests, will all be able to come together in the public interest. And common sense and logic will tell them what the nation's needs are at particular times in particular situations. The only way that that can happen, these people believed, is if the citizenry was able to rely on the idea of civic virtue. The whole success of the republic depended, they believed, on the virtue of its people, on the willingness of its people to put aside self-interest and hostility and bigotry and envy and all the other negatives and put the public interest first. The history of the period from the Declaration of Independence through the Confederation period and through ratification of the Constitution, we have learned is the story of what we can best call a misplaced idealism. Many people in the nation began to believe quickly, soon, after independence, that the civic virtue so necessary to the success of the republic was not there, and that self-interest reinforced by political power located on the local level, on the state level, rather than on the national level, made it possible for self-interest to dominate government. Instead of government dictating the need and calling forth the virtue of its own people, the realities of political structure under the Articles of Confederation was that government became susceptible to organized self-interest. And organized efforts of self-interested people were able to dictate what was going on in government at the local level, at the state level. Majority rule, in many cases, was driving or dictating what was happening in the state legislatures. More than anything else, James Madison said, this spoke to the need for revision of the Articles of Confederation, or what ultimately becomes the decision to scrap the Articles entirely and replace it with a whole new form of government, the Constitution of the United States. That's the theme that we've looked at and we've traced through over the many months here at the Virtual Center. Nowhere in that scenario is there a mention of political parties. In fact, if you think about it, there's nowhere in that scenario for political parties at all. There's nothing in there that suggests the idea of a loyal opposition or well-intentioned disagreement or different points of view that might be legitimate on the major issues. The assumption was that the best interest of the nation will be visible and will be clear to all rational people, and that rational people committed to the success of the nation and the success of the republic will put aside their own self-interest, their own priorities and prejudices, and follow their noses, if you will, to the public interest. The Constitution of the United States speaks to the fact that many of those who ratified it believed that the idealism of 1776 was misplaced, that the civic virtue that the Republic so depended on was not there, and that somehow you had to find an alternative. You had to organize the Republic a different way, or we would disintegrate. We would literally implode from within. Whether it was section against section, North versus South, region against region, state against state, whatever. Many people began to recognize that the only thing that held the nation together, of course at the time it wasn't a nation during the war itself, the thing more than anything that held it together was the threat of the British Army. The thinking was that once the war ended, the sectionalism and diversity within America would cause the nation to implode. And there was every indication by the late 1780s that that implosion might be going to happen. It looked like it was going to happen between North and South. It almost destroyed the Constitutional Convention itself. So consequently, there's nowhere in that whole frame of reference, in that whole way of thinking, to suggest that parties can in any way be good. Rather, the success of the Republic depended on its ability to negate parties, to prevent their emergence, to make sure they never happened. The idea is that there's a public interest, and any other interest competing with that public interest is a negative and cannot be condoned. No wonder there's no mention in the Constitution of the United States about the legitimacy of the positive good contained in the concept of political parties. I think that's the point at which we need to begin our investigation. And I'd like to do that. We have just topped the top of our first hour. It's 1 minute past the hour, 1 minute past 2 Eastern Standard Time. You are listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause for a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back with our second hour and our attention to the issue of political parties. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to our second hour here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this beautiful, beautiful, but very chilly January Monday. It is a pleasure to be with you today. I do invite you to share your thoughts and your ideas with us. At the bottom of the first 30 minutes of programming today, I believe, completed the Justice John Paul Stevens' dissent in the Supreme Court case, the very prominent Supreme Court case of District of Columbia versus Heller. And at that time, I solicited your input or comments or whatever on that particular issue. And then in our second half hour of our first hour in today's program, I think we went through a little bit of the story or the background about the attitude towards political parties during the founding period, from the beginning of the approval of the positive vote on January 7th, 1776, of the decision to draft a Declaration of Independence and go to war to fight the mother country for our independence, through ratification of the Constitution in 1788. Again, I do invite your participation in our program. Again, our phone number, area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with us that way, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. And again, there's always the option of going to our Facebook page and reacting or commenting on the postings that are there. I kind of expect, I'm anticipating, that sometime this evening I'll be posting something related to the issue of two parties, because that's going to be the theme of our programming for the rest of this week and probably for a bit of time after that. I really think that this is an important issue to understand. I think that, let me kind of jump to the end first, if you will. Go right to the caboose, right at the end of this train, and look at that first. There are many people who believe that the reality and the contribution of political parties is the touchstone, the keystones to the success of our political system. Whereas at the time of the founding, there was an attitude that parties would be the downfall of the republic. There are many people today who believe that the functioning and viability of a meaningful, thriving two-party system may indeed be the only thing that can save the republic. There's a lot of ground to cover between those two extremes. Parties are bad and they should never be here, versus parties are so critical that if anything happens to them, our republic will not be able to survive it. Those goalposts are pretty wide apart, it seems to me. It wouldn't take much of a field goal kicker to kick one between those two. But it seems to me there's quite a bit of territory between those two poles, those two posts. And I'd like to cover some of that in our program here at the Virtual Center, because I think all of us need to understand the importance of this issue. And let me tell you that there's quite a bit to it. And here at this point in my career, I continue to learn more and more and more about something I thought I understood quite well for so long. And again, I have you in this particular program, Bob Kincaid and the folks at the Head On Radio Network. I have all of you to thank for the opportunity and the incentive to pursue this topic and to come upon and discover things that I hadn't really considered, I hadn't really thought about before, which I think contribute to the depth and substance and significance of this particular topic. So with your approval, and again, I invite you to utilize our phone number. With your approval, I'd like to take on this particular issue. Let me begin by mentioning a book that many of you probably are familiar with or have heard of. It was written in the 1960s, 1969 to be accurate, by Richard Hofstadter. Richard Hofstadter was one of the most insightful historians of the American scene, especially America in the 18th and early 19th centuries, that I've come across. I think he's one of our greatest historians. He went through a number of changes. There was a time when he flirted with socialism. From what I know about Richard Hofstadter's career, he was at Columbia University during much of the protest period of the 1960s. And it appears that he became very disillusioned by the extremism of many of the protests. And he began to move further and further right toward the end of his life. And much of that movement is reflected in a lot of his later books. He seems to be searching toward the end. He seems to be searching for the common denominator, for the thing that held everybody together. In other words, he seems to be one of those people that's committed to the idea of moderation or the center. And that's quite a movement for him from where he had been earlier in his career. The book I'm referring to deals specifically with the issues of political parties. Its title, The Idea of a Party System. Subtitle, The Rise of Legitimate Opposition in the United States, 1780 to 1840. So this book covers a 60-year period. From the end of from the securing of independence, theoretically the end of the War for Independence, 1780, up to the time then to the time when the nation becomes obsessed about the sectional discord between North and South, that's going to produce the Civil War. So it's during that 60-year period that Hofstadter's research tells him that America's development and final recognition of the existence of the existing two-party system happened. The evolution of American thinking on political parties happened during that 60-year period. This book is about that evolution. Let me make a couple of general comments about the book itself. More specifically, its title. First, I call your attention to the fact that the title of this book is The Idea of a Political System. By definition, then, Hofstadter's major theme deals with theory. It's about the idea of a party system. It wallows or focuses principally in the area of abstraction. It deals with philosophy. It deals with the major thinking of the individual leaders who are driving this particular movement towards a party system. Second thing I would call your attention to in the title is the word system. We spent quite a bit of time, if you'll remember, some weeks ago. We were talking about Alexander Hamilton's economic system as system. And we spent quite a bit of time focusing on the meaning of the word system. I won't go back through all of that now. But the suggestion then of Hofstadter's title, The Idea of a Party System, suggests that in America, political parties, as they evolved, did not focus principally on the self-interests which gave rise to parties, but on the system which the coming together of those different parties created. In other words, the emphasis is on system. And the implication is that if the American political system adopts a system of political parties, then by definition, our overall republic, the political system itself, must look upon the idea of a party system as a positive. If that's true, if this nation does consider the idea of a party system as a positive, then that's a 180-degree turnaround from what existed at the time of the founding, when parties in most people's minds were very negative and were entities to be avoided at all costs. Hofstadter opens his book with a quotation from the very famous Thomas Macaulay, Thomas Babington Macaulay, in a book called Lays of Ancient Rome. And this is the poem in question, and this is the opening of Hofstadter's book. So obviously the theme of this particular quote, this particular poem, stanza of a poem, to Hofstadter, means something very significant. Here it is. Then none was for a party. Then all were for the state. Then the great man helped the poor, and the poor man loved the great. I want to spend a little bit of time. I love that. I just think that is absolutely delicious. Then, and what he's talking about then, 1776, we'll say. Then none was for a party. Then all were for the state. The idea of civic virtue, the public interest, the best interests of the nation, the best interests of the republic. Man's reason would cause all good people to rally around the public interest as defined by reason in a particular situation. So none was for a party, all were for the state. Then the great man helped the poor, and the poor man loved the great. The implication in Macaulay's last two lines then is that when there are no parties, when there's no discord or division within the people, there is genuine affection and concern within the society at large, one for another. The wealthy are inclined to take care of the poor. The poor are inclined to respect and value and model their behavior after the wealthy. In other words, there's no divisions that divide society. Let me add one more thought to this particular stanza of this particular poem before we leave it. The implication of Macaulay's poem is the same thing that drives James Madison's Federalist Number 10. Madison says in Federalist Number 10 that throughout history, forever, the major cause of factions has been the various and unequal distribution of property. The differences between those who have property, who have wealth, and those who don't, Madison says, has always been the major cause of friction in every society. That's what Macaulay's talking about here. When you don't have parties, the wealthy take care of the poor, and the poor worship the wealthy. In other words, there's community. There's internal respect. There's no discord. There are no parties. So the implication of Macaulay's statement here is the same thing that Madison says in Federalist Number 10. The major cause of factions, the major cause of parties, is principally the differences in wealth, in property. Obviously, if Madison's correct, and if Macaulay is correct, and if the nation comes around to a realization that a party system is a good thing, then somehow somebody has figured out a way to redefine party in such a way that instead of reflecting the divisions within society, party has changed to become the mechanism that brings the groups back together again, that brings the different interests back together again. I would suggest then that the mere fact that Hofstadter opens his book with Macaulay's stanza, with Macaulay's poem, indicates that the party system Hofstadter is writing about somehow by 1840 becomes the solution to the divisions and the diversity which gave rise to parties early on and were the basic reasons why people were so opposed to parties before. In other words, Hofstadter's book, the idea of a party system, suggests that it's parties that can best resolve the divisions and the dilemmas and the self-interests which divide societies. The subtitle of Hofstadter's book, The Rise of Legitimate Opposition in the United States, the key word there is not opposition, it seems to me. The key word is legitimate. Because when you think about it, at the very beginning of this period, 1780, Hofstadter says, the quest for community suggests that opposition is a negative. Opposition is another word for party. So the thinking is that if parties were looked down upon, were frowned upon at the time of the founding, then so was the idea of opposition. The idea was, I guess, that when it comes to the public interest, when it comes to the best interests of the nation, there ought to be no opposition. Everybody ought to be headed in the same direction. Reason and common sense would tell thinking, honest people what the best interest would be at a particular point in time. So Hofstadter's subtitle, The Rise of Legitimate Opposition, suggests to me two things. It suggests that opposition is a given. It suggests that the thinking that you could eliminate parties, which means eliminate opposition, that you could find a way to eliminate the hostility between rich and poor, which always divided societies. The implication of Hofstadter's subtitle is that by 1840, people had come to realize that there was always going to be opposition, that you couldn't get rid of it. The idealism of 1776 was that through the promotion of civic virtue, you could eliminate opposition. By 1840, the reality had set in that not only couldn't you get rid of opposition, but that somehow you had to find a way to systematize opposition in order that it became legitimate, that it was accepted, that it was not only something you had to live with, but rather it was something that you could turn from a negative into a positive good. I would suggest to you that that's really the theme, the thesis of Hofstadter's book on the idea of a party system. Hofstadter basically lays out three different approaches or attitudes towards parties. The first one is that parties are bad. They are evil. That they speak or they scream division. They scream discord. And they are to be prevented. The second position is that parties are always there. They will always be there. There's nothing you can do about them. They're just something we're going to have to learn to deal with. And the best thing we can do is figure out a way to control them so that they don't hurt us any more than they, by implication, are designed to do. Madison's Federalist number 10. His whole strategy, the Constitution of the United States, Madison tells us in Federalist number 10, is the answer, is the solution to controlling the violence of faction. So Madison has reached the conclusion, if you can't get rid of them, you better figure out a way to control them. And then the third approach to party that Hofstadter addresses is implied in his subtitle, the idea of a legitimate opposition. The idea that you can devise a party system in such a way that you can turn a negative into a positive. You can turn the evils of opposition and discord and division and party and faction. You can structure it in such a way that you can turn it into a positive good. Let me make one point here before we get off this. If a party system is to be a positive good, if you reach that conclusion that opposition is legitimate and that a party system can be a positive, then that implies that you got to have it. That implies that this party system, by definition, must function. Think about that. This is one of the most fascinating, for me, conundrums or confusions or contradictions or whatever you wanted to call it. I think in all of the stuff that we've been thinking about. I mean, just think about this for a second. By definition, the purpose of the Republican Party in the 2016 elections is to elect the candidate that becomes so popular that the Democratic Party will be obliterated. That the Republicans will not only win the White House, but will win such overwhelming control of both houses of the legislature, House of Representatives and Senate, that Republican control will be effectively unchallenged. That we won't have to worry anymore about such things as the supermajority, the filibuster, the 60-vote majority in the Senate. All of that thing will be gone. That our victory will be so overwhelming that the Democratic opposition will become inconsequential. The other side of that coin is that the contest between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and Governor O'Malley, I think he's still up there, so I guess we still need to consider him, is that they will be able to pull such a majority, such support from the American people, they'll be able to turn out the vote of the non-voters to such a degree that not only will the Democratic Party be able to keep control of the White House after President Obama leaves, but as Bernie Sanders talks about, I can't do this by myself. There's got to be a revolution. We need to retake the Senate. We need to retake the House. In other words, the goal of the Democratic Party is to obliterate as much as possible the Republican Party. In other words, the nature of our two-party system and its leaders is to overwhelming and destroy the other. It's not to engage in a contest which is close. Its goal is to manage a campaign which becomes an overwhelming slaughter of your side against the other side. That's the reality of what the leaders of each of our political parties want to see happen. They want to see their party win an overwhelming victory to the point that the other party becomes inconsequential. Yet Hofstadter is talking about the idea of a party system, the principle of legitimate opposition. If you look at the title of Hofstadter's book, then the implication of Hofstadter's book is that if opposition is legitimate, and if you are able to function or fashion a party system that can make opposition legitimate, then the definition is you've got to have a functioning, viable two-party system if the nation is going to survive. So you've got the leadership looking in one direction, but the scholarship suggesting something quite different. The closer the elections are between Democrats and Republicans, the more of a real close contest and competition we have, the stronger our political system, the stronger our party system is functioning and making that political system. That's why the Larry Kramer business that we talked about earlier today is so important. If there's going to be opposition, and if you devise a system to deal with the reality of that opposition, then the mere fact that you've got a system means that the opposition has to remain viable. It's got to be there. Going back to Madison's Federalist Number 10 and using his language, if the Constitution of the United States was principally created to control the violence of faction, then by definition, you've got to have factions. You can't eliminate them. Madison says it's sown into the nature of man. So if you can't eliminate them, you've got to control them. The fact of the matter is, if you succeed in controlling them, then they better not disappear. You better have a viable, competitive, close system. It's kind of like the NFL. We're in the playoffs now, so I guess the analogy or the comparison is a good one. We look back on the 4 games this past weekend in the NFL, and we talk about the benefits and the value of competition and the idea of respecting your opponent and may the best man win. But the fact of the matter is, no one of the four teams wants the results to be close. Every team wants to go out like the Carolina Panthers did yesterday and go out to a 31-0 lead at the half. That's the way everybody wants to do it. They want to slaughter the opposition. And if you think about the supporters of the different teams, that's what they want too. I'll own up to this. I'm a supporter of the New England Patriots. I have been from the very beginning. I can remember going to football games when they were the Boston Patriots and Babe Parilli was the quarterback. I mean, that's how far back I go. So I've been a Patriots supporter from the very beginning. I sat there on Saturday evening and I watched that game begin at 4:35 p.m. Eastern Time. I watched that game, the whole game. And I was dying. I was agonizing. I wanted the Patriots to win 50-0. Oh, yeah, you can talk about competition and what a great game it was and how close it was. And you can talk about the value of, at the end of the game, Rodgers for the Packers threw the Hail Mary pass when there was no time left on the clock and tied the game up and sent it in overtime. Oh, my God, that's what the spirit of competition, that's what, the idea of legitimate opposition and competition is all about. But the fact of the matter is that's not what we really want. We want to slaughter the opposition. The NFL teams want to. Their fans want to. And it's only the scholars, it's only the philosophers who talk about the benefits of competition and may the best man win and shake the hand of your opponent when it's over and all the rest of it. So we're operating in two different directions at the same time is what I'm saying. The implication is that that same principle functions, is alive and well as we look at the issues of two parties. Hofstadter treats it. I want to share some of it with you. But remember his overall theme, because I think this is important. In the early period, in the founding period, it's that parties are bad and the best thing that we can do is find a way that they don't exist. By 1787 at the Constitutional Convention, Madison has become convinced that parties will always exist. So the best hope we have is to find a way to control them so that they don't destroy us. And then by 1840, which is the end of the period of Hofstadter's book, by 1840, the general conclusion has been reached that since parties are always going to be with us, then what we have to do is have a system that turns the negatives that parties seem to present us, turn those into a positive. And the way to do that is to systematize our political party system. But the fact of the matter is, once you do that, and once you base the success of the entire nation on the functioning of a legitimate party system, you better have parties so that that system can function. Which means you better not reach the point where one party destroys the other party. Proof? Look back through American history. Look back at those elections, those periods, when one party won such an overwhelming lopsided victory that it appeared that our two-party system was at an end. Look at the victory of FDR over Herbert Hoover in the election of 1932. when the nation was mired in the midst of the Great Depression. And it appeared that nothing that Hoover was proposing was going to pull us out of this depression, was going to solve it. Roosevelt wins an overwhelming victory. The Republican Party is pretty much knocked back on its heels. But it doesn't take long for the idealism that gave Roosevelt the overwhelming victory to somewhat dissipate. Think back to the election of Lyndon Johnson over Barry Goldwater in 1964. Those of you who can remember back that far will remember the very famous Daisy commercial that the Democratic Party ran on behalf of Lyndon Johnson's candidacy. What the Democratic Party did was take the aggression and the bombastic commentary of Goldwater about using the big one, about using our atomic superiority to coerce our enemies. And the Democratic Party put together a campaign commercial which showed this little blonde girl in a field of daisies, picking daisies. And in the background, the countdown was coming, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. And then the mushroom cloud would emerge. And on the screen would come the caption, vote Lyndon Johnson for president. The implication, Goldwater will take us into a nuclear war. Only Johnson can help us keep a world in which little girls like this can continue to go into a field and pick daisies. The Democratic victory in 1964 was overwhelming. What happened after that overwhelming victory in 1964? The violence of the late 1960s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war protests. When the two-party system was on the verge of becoming non-functional, the nation began flying in 10 different directions. It didn't look like the nation could even survive the 1960s. Think of the election of 1980, Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter. Think of how overwhelming Ronald Reagan's victory was. Think about how much faith, how much stock the American voters put into defeating Carter and bringing in the Republicans. What happened in the 1980s after that overwhelming victory? The point is, it seems historically like whenever one party's victory over the other becomes too overwhelming, the victorious party breaks up into a variety of different factions. Why? Because the thing that forces these factions to work together, namely the opposition party, has become dysfunctional. When one party so overwhelms the other that its victory is overwhelming, the victorious power tends to break up into factions, into different parts. And that's the point. It's the existence of the viable opposition party that holds the various constituencies of the other party together. The only way that they have a chance to win anything is to work together to defeat the other party. And the same thing is true within the other party. So in other words, each side needs the other. That's the system that Hofstadter is talking about. That's the legitimacy of the opposition. That's what's not happening in Washington right now. The dysfunction of the political system on the national level is creating the discord in the Republican Party, which started this campaign with 17 different candidates and still functions with close to a dozen. The only consensus that seems to exist within the Republican Party is to get rid of the old guard totally, is to get politicians totally out of the game and turn leadership over to a Donald Trump or a Ben Carson or a Ted Cruz, as it's turning out. In other words, the dysfunction that exists amongst the two parties on the national level, if it's not corrected, if we don't find a way around the polarization, which is making it impossible for the parties to work together, if we don't find a way around it, then the system that the nation was able to create in the early 19th century to manage diversity within our society will not function. The system will break down. And when the system breaks down, we will all be in trouble. Let's, in a few minutes that's left in our program today, right now we've got 52 minutes after the hour, so we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left in our program. Let's look at a couple of examples of what we're talking about. Let's go back to the very beginning. Jonathan Swift, England, in his book called Thoughts on Various Subjects, Jonathan Swift made the comment that, quote, "Party is the madness of many for the gain of the few," unquote. The whole idea of a political party, says Jonathan Swift, is a mechanism whereby the wealthy manipulate the poor. The few manipulate the many. It's a negative. Party is a negative. It needs to be avoided. When we organize with other people, we think we're going to have a legitimate chance at getting power. But what you find is that this is more political manipulation than anything else. John Adams made the comment talking about a spirit of party. He said this is, of course, when he was president, or when he was vice president under Washington, during the period of the so-called Washington's farewell address. John Adams made the comment, said, "A division of the republic into two great parties is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution." This was the basic thinking in the late 18th century and before that in America about the nature of political parties. They were bad and they needed to be avoided at all costs. Why? I would suggest to you the best way that I can explain this is that during this period, when people looked at the word party, they saw the word faction. When people looked at the word party, they thought about organized self-interest. By definition, self-interest works against the best interest of the public at large. That's what Madison said in Federalist Number 10 about factions. Factions are organized interest groups. They can either be a majority or a minority of the whole, but their purpose is to find a way to satisfy their own self-interests at the expense of the public interest. So during this period, when John Adams is writing, when Jonathan Swift is writing, what they are talking about, they are using the word party, but they mean the same thing that Madison meant when he used the term faction. So I think that's the key to remember. And this isn't mine. This is taken from Hofstadter's book. And I think it's something that Hofstadter says that I think we all need to think about. The idea that party can become something good, that you can take a negative and turn it into a positive, Hofstadter says, is pretty sophisticated stuff. That's a pretty sophisticated notion. And I think all of us need to understand that. So this is where we're going. We barely scratched the surface of this topic. It's fantastic. It's just so loaded. There's so much to it. I think there's so much to be learned from it. So I encourage you to stick with us here at the Virtual Center as we pursue this particular topic. So obviously, we're going to move from a period in which people are opposed to party to the recognition, which Madison reaches at the time of the Constitution, that factions or parties are inevitable. They're sewn into the nature of man. So what you have to do somehow is structure your system in such a way that you control their effects. Remember Madison's Federalist Number 10. If you can't get rid of the causes, then you find a way to control the effects. That means you're taking a negative, you realize that you can't get rid of the negative. Somehow you need to maneuver or manipulate the negative so that it will do as little damage as possible. That still means that parties are negatives. I think the way to begin this is to look at the best example that I've seen in American history of parties being negatives, and that's to take a look at George Washington's farewell address, when he leaves the nation by giving it advice, his advice on how to deal with the problems it's going to confront in the future. But we have to postpone that for another day. It's 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for staying with us today here at the Virtual Center. I want to invite you to come back tomorrow, Tuesday. Remember, we will start 1/2 hour later on Tuesday. This is Bill O'Brien. Have a wonderful evening. Be good to each other, and thank you.